what I hope to see in the next year is that the new things that you have not yet seen on Ethereum start emerging on Bitcoin L2s, because there's reason for projects to not go first build on ETH and then replicate it on Bitcoin, but go first to Bitcoin, because that is such a huge market and not as crowded. And if you win on Bitcoin, the difference is you win the entire market.
What would stop someone from doing that then? Hey everyone, welcome to Talking Tokens, a podcast focused on interviewing the best crypto founders, market players, and up-and-coming startups that are changing the industry every single Tuesday and Thursday. I'm Jacquelyn Melanik, your award-nominated host and former senior crypto reporter turned entrepreneur, and I'm excited to be here with you all. Now, let's get into it. Today's guest is Alexei Zamyatin. He is a co-founder of Build on Bitcoin, or Bob. Bob is a layer 2 hybrid that is powered by Bitcoin and Ethereum and built on the OP stack. I'm excited to talk about Bob, its journey since the mainnet launch earlier this year, and how things are going in between DeFi and Bitcoin. So Alexei, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. And to start off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the space?
Sure. So I'm Alexei. I'm one of the co-founders of Bob, and I've been working on Bitcoin for almost 10 years now.
That's a long time.
I don't look like it yet, but I definitely have some gray hair from fighting a lot about whether Bitcoin should change and what it should be used for, and if we should only hold it or if it's okay to do more innovative things with Bitcoin itself. I think we're winning now. I think we're seeing more innovation. I'm a computer scientist by trade. I got into Bitcoin research mainly by coincidence. I was doing a bachelor thesis, looking mainly into things like IT security focused topics, like obfuscating Tor traffic. And my supervisor was also offering topics around Bitcoin and also things around name coins, so decentralizing DNS, censorship resistance. And I really got hooked on that. So not necessarily I didn't get into Bitcoin because of the financial aspect of Bitcoin as an asset, but rather about what we could do in terms of, improving security, improving transparency and censorship resistance. And then did a bit of a random walk looking into merge mining, did some of the very early research there, decentralized mining pools, payment channels, color coins. So bit of everything. And then ended up doing a PhD in computer science at Imperial College London, focusing on sidechains and bridges. Not that a PhD qualifies you to anything in particular in the space, obviously, but it does help. It was the best kind of way for me back then to really focus on the technology side of things. And it had this interesting kind of industry aspect because it was funded by blockchain.com. So we really kind of also worked on like Lightning initially, and then really focused on bridges and how to get them into practice and production, and how we could allow people to use Bitcoin on other networks to do more, because we'd accepted that Bitcoin doesn't really fork often. So you're not going to see smart contracts on Bitcoin.
Right. Before we get into Bob, I wanted to ask you, since you've been in the space and, really focused on Bitcoin researching for the past 10 years, out of all the things you just brought up, or maybe one you haven't brought up, where do you think there is a lot of potential still that maybe hasn't been tapped into as much as you think it should?
I mean, we've spent 10 years working on it, and it still isn't quite solved, but with BitVM, we're really close. So I think the biggest untapped potential is bringing innovation back into Bitcoin. We spend a lot of time working on bridges and how do we bring Bitcoin into other ecosystems. I think the biggest opportunity right now is to bring innovation, bring DeFi and like smart accounts, SocialFi, all these new things that we're seeing on Ethereum and other networks, on Solana and so on, back into the Bitcoin ecosystem and allow us to build them on Bitcoin in the form of layer 2s. And the reason I say that is 99.9% of altcoins and alt chains started back in the days with the premise of, we can do something you cannot do on Bitcoin. But imagine what's going to happen when you can do all of these things on Bitcoin. And I think that is something very interesting that I'd love to see happen.
Yeah, I mean, the company's name is literally a call to action, Build on Bitcoin, right? But aside from the obvious, why did you decide to create this, and how does it being a hybrid kind of play into that? I don't think I've really spoken to anyone who has a hybrid L2, so we've got to talk about that as well.
Absolutely. The hybrid L2, I mean, it sounds fancy and so on, but the idea was not necessarily to just create something fancy for, for ethos and hype. It was actually a very pragmatic decision. The vision of Bob, as the name states, is to get people to build on Bitcoin. Right. Start doing this now, and not only in a couple of years. Don't wait for a fork. And yes, BitVM is going to happen, but again, it's going to take some time until it can really build an entire economy on top of that. And one thing we learned from building in this space and in Bitcoin and Ethereum, but also other ecosystems, is that tech does not always win. Not in the first instance. You need both. You need to have good technology, but you need to make it accessible, usable, and people need to be able to build on top of it. And when we are trying to build Bitcoin layer 2s, we need to solve three problems. The first one being, Bitcoin security and trust minimized Bitcoin bridging, right? The layer 2 needs to really inherit Bitcoin security, and we need to get Bitcoin in and out without trusting anybody else. That's pretty clear. With BitVM, we finally have this blueprint. But there's two other problems. There's the ecosystem problem, where builders have to be able to go to market fast. They have to be able to launch their products fast. They have to be able to raise funding, integrate institutions. And that is something that is not possible on every network today, because many L1s and L2s still see themselves as deep tech companies, but they're not. L1s and L2s are platforms. They are actually software as a service businesses. They're only as successful as the dApps that build on them. And we've been on the other side. We've built dApps. We've built within ecosystems that didn't see it this way. And that's why the doctrine we have at Bob is really dApps are clients, and we need to make sure they're successful. And that's why Bob picked the OP stack. And that's also how the idea for the hybrid design was born. Because the hybrid design allows us to tap into the best-in-class infrastructure of Ethereum, the network effects, the tooling, the power users, the integrations with exchanges and institutions, and bootstrap quickly allow teams that want to build on Bitcoin now to go to market fast versus waiting for a long time or rebuilding the entire stack from scratch. And the last kind of problem we need to solve is that of liquidity, not just Bitcoin liquidity, but also liquidity in other assets and stable coins, and also Ethereum. And if you look at the market, Bitcoin, ETH, and stablecoins make up 95% of the trading volume. So of course you should allow your apps to access that. And that's again where Ethereum offers a massive advantage of being a hybrid, as we are, mainly means we're being connected to both Ethereum and Bitcoin. We can tap into Ethereum early on to bootstrap liquidity, to bootstrap users, to grow faster, and also make sure that when you're building on a new dApp, a new project right now, you'd go to Ethereum because that's the best. Like obviously that's the natural decision making process. You have infrastructure, tech, in-network effects. But now with Bob, well, there is no difference between building on base optimism or Bob in terms of infrastructure. And that, of course, makes the choice easier, because now you could say, well, okay, it's the same infra. I have access to Ethereum assets, but maybe I also want to have access to Bitcoin. And that is the unique opportunity of being a hybrid, because you can actually combine the best of these two worlds.
So Bob is a part of the superchain, right? Since you guys are built on the OP stack.
That is correct, yes.
How many users in the superchain are really interested in the Bitcoin aspect? Obviously, as you mentioned, there's a ton of liquidity there across the board, but within the superchain ecosystem, what do you think is the traction there?
Well, I think there's a lot of traction, a lot of demand for Bitcoin, and for two reasons. One is, of course, every user in crypto, I think, is a Bitcoiner at heart somewhere. 90% plus of people got into Web3 through Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Many people still have Bitcoin. They just don't know what to do with it. Some power users have wrapped it and are using it on Ethereum and L2s, but with WBTC, that's not as accessible to everyone as we'd like it to be. But now there's more versions. Coinbase just launched CBBTC, and you saw the demand there, right? Even if it's just on Base and Ethereum initially, the demand is clearly visible. People want to use Bitcoin because it is the best collateral asset. It is the best thing to borrow against in DeFi and to actually use to start kind of, as the backbone asset for your DeFi strategies. So I think, looking at the demand we've seen on Ethereum and also other previous bridging attempts like RAMBTC, and also the recent growth of TBTC now kind of finally being vindicated for sticking around for so long and offering a more decentralized alternative. I think the signs are all pointing in the same direction. Bitcoin's going to be a thing. And then if you look at the same time at the ascent of Bitcoin liquid staking assets and also alternative wrapped Bitcoin versions like FBTC, it feels like, we're really entering this hot phase of the Bitcoin renaissance where everybody wants to get into Bitcoin. And I think, I guess a controversial opinion would be if you as a project don't have a Bitcoin strategy, you're going to have a hard time in the next 2 years.
Mm. Why do you think it's such a renaissance now opposed to maybe last market cycle?
I think it's to people who, have not spent a lot of time in Bitcoin, it seems like it's all of a sudden there's a spark and, so much excitement and it's growing out of nowhere. But that's not quite how it went. There was a lot of work being done, a lot of fighting, blood and sweat to get Bitcoin to where it is today, right? I remember myself and there's lots of people who've been building on Bitcoin on the verge of other ecosystems. We would get uninvited. I would get uninvited from some technical maxi conferences because I was talking about Bitcoin bridges.
By Bitcoiners.
Now, yeah. I mean, and we need to distinguish between, I'm a Bitcoin maxi
the Bitcoin
myself.
maxis, right? Yeah.
But I guess the more laser eye kind of maxis, the ones that I guess cared more about the code status of Bitcoin rather than the technology. Mm-hmm. There were still the technical conferences that would remain neutral, which I've always found great in Bitcoin. But over time, you saw more and more people leave gradually to other ecosystems. And then there was this kind of shift, and it felt like it was a sudden shift, but it actually was, this building up pressure around people that wanted to do something with Bitcoin. They were trying to find ways to do it, but they couldn't. And when the Taproot upgrade happened, it was never intended to allow something like ordinals. It was intended for something completely different. It was intended to make Lightning better and add some privacy features. But what happened is it kind of allowed us to do bigger Bitcoin blocks indirectly. And suddenly we could store data on Bitcoin much more, in a much easier way. Previously, we were kind of limited by how much we could plug into a transaction. And suddenly you could store more data on Bitcoin. And we had some advancing scripting techniques that also led to the creation of BitVM. So that was one technical change. It took some time after the Taproot upgrade for people to figure it out. At the same time, you had this cultural shift. You had more people started to look into Taproot, and more of the people that were using NFTs, that were using DeFi, started to experiment with this. People who had previously left started coming back to see, well, maybe what is this Taproot thing? Maybe I could do something with it. And then when ordinals were created, NFTs on Bitcoin, it just exploded, right? Suddenly you could do NFTs on Bitcoin, and that was unheard of. And that's when you saw this kind of instant shift in culture. Masses of people came back to Bitcoin, started to experiment with it. And the interesting bit here is, yes, there was initial this uproar of this core, this Bitcoin laser maxi community that Bitcoin should only be used for important things and not for fun. But it subsided so quickly because that community actually is quite small and doesn't have as much influence and is only allowed on Twitter. Mm-hmm. But when the users started coming in, the new, the power users won quickly. They became the loudest voice. They became the users of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially the reason why we have this Bitcoin renaissance today. You had this technical development that just takes a long time at Bitcoin, and suddenly it was there, paired with the hunger of, I think, many people to go and do things with Bitcoin, and also looking for ways to differentiate themselves in a very crowded market, and NFTs, and also now in other projects. Mm-hmm. And that combination led to this kind of renaissance.
Yeah. I was going to ask, which community do you think has the most influence to actually make Bitcoin DeFi proliferate across the whole ecosystem, or even outside of the ecosystem into other pockets and areas like institutions and so on?
That's a good question. I would say ours. The community of people who are pragmatic enough to use DeFi on Ethereum, love DeFi on Ethereum, but also open to experiment with Solana. Mm-hmm. But our Bitcoiners at heart and have had a soft spot for Bitcoin forever and would love to use their Bitcoin for more. And you'd be surprised how big that community is. It's ultimately, if you go to an Ethereum conference and you ask people, well, how many of you have Bitcoin? Everybody will raise their hand, but vice versa. If you go to Bitcoin events now and you ask, well, how many of you have Ether? Everybody's going to raise their hand. So there is this very big pool of power users that have embraced Web3 and DeFi across multiple networks, but started with Bitcoin. And I think that is going to be the driving factor of innovation. Of course, you still have the core developers that have a lot of influence in terms of what happens to the core Bitcoin protocol. But the cool thing is we don't need any changes with BitVM and all the new developments there. We don't need any changes to Bitcoin. We can do whatever we like on Bitcoin without asking for a change. And I think that's how it should be. Maybe in the future, once we have shown that there is demand, like we've built a flourishing, booming DeFi ecosystem on Bitcoin layer 2s, and we need this one change to massively improve costs or security. Well, then it's a much easier thing to go and ask for a soft fork, because there's this huge community with billions of dollars in assets that will benefit from this. Mm-hmm. And I generally think that if we do that, that's how you can actually upgrade Bitcoin, and not vice versa, asking for a change now to do something in the future.
Mm-hmm. How would you characterize the state of Bitcoin DeFi today? I feel like, it's being talked about. There's a lot of developments happening, but it's still, and I hate using this saying, but it's in its early days, because it is, compared to maybe Ethereum, which has a very strong and proliferated ecosystem, or even Solana or other chains like Avalanche, Polygon, but Polygon's in L2. So I guess that goes back to Ethereum. How would you define Bitcoin DeFi, and where do you think it's going to go within, let's say, the next year?
Well, I would actually disagree with this, the fact that, or the claim that Bitcoin DeFi is still very early. Mm-hmm. It's been around for a long, long time.
I guess that there hasn't been a ton of advancements in that. It's behind in the sense that it hasn't gotten the adoption and traction and growth that Ethereum has.
That is true. If you look at it percentage-wise, Ethereum's TVL to market cap ratio is 30% if you include the TVL and L2s. On Bitcoin, it's 0.1%, right? So there's a 300x growth potential, and also we have to achieve that growth to match Ethereum in terms of then we can say we've had the same level of DeFi with Bitcoin. But we have had double BTC on Ethereum. You've had Bitcoin on Binance. You had Bitcoin on Avalanche. You had Bitcoin on Solana. Unfortunately, not as successful due to the hack. But it's been around, and at peak times, you had $20 billion worth of BTC in DeFi across different chains. Now, sure, these bridges weren't decentralized, but it's been around for a while now. But it always was fragmented on other chains. It was being integrated into some protocols, but it wasn't as widely accessible. So I definitely agree with that. And what we see today is L2s on Bitcoin and sidechains, or whatever you want to call them, will enable this. And I think our job is to do two things. First, level the playing field, make sure that you can build the same things as you see on Ethereum, but with Bitcoin. Just, and there's so many different Bitcoin versions nowadays. And the second step is to enable primitives that allow us to do more exciting things with Bitcoin. So not just, wrapping it, supplying it into lending or trading it. That already works. And we're seeing this. I mean, you can do that on Bob. You can do this on all the other L2s on Bitcoin, right? We have Uniswap, for example. We have a bunch of lending protocols. We have perps. You can do the same thing as you could on Ethereum, but with Bitcoin assets. That is solved. But the exciting things are the ones that you don't yet have on Ethereum. And that are things like Bitcoin liquid staking with Babylon and a few others coming out, I guess, in the near future. You have a way to stake your Bitcoin, to use the asset as something that can secure another protocol. Mm-hmm. We've seen the success of that with EigenLayer and a bunch of competitors now emerging, and it's a multi-billion-dollar market on Ethereum. Now imagine what this could look like on Bitcoin, especially considering that the rewards, the returns, the yield, whatever, the staking rates that you need on Bitcoin they're not high, because the base return rate on Bitcoin, right, is very low. You don't really get much if you blend out your Bitcoin. And then, of course, you have things like tokenized hash rate, and essentially a lot of products that try to take Bitcoin as the asset and do more with it, whether it's in non-custodial staking, whether you try to tokenize the hash rate and you're investing into hash rate derivative products, or you're opening DeFi vaults and you're kind of combining different DeFi strategies into a one-click deployment and making that accessible. Or if you're also going more into the CDeFi direction, as you've seen with examples of Athena, and now you can use similar products with Bitcoin as the input asset. And that's just the start. So I do think it's still in its infancy. It's at very early stages, but it's developing at lightning speed. It's speed running through what Ethereum has been doing for the last 5 years, because a lot of this, there's a playbook for it. And what we're just doing now is we're taking Bitcoin and we're plugging it into these existing kind of ideas. And what I hope to see in the next year, half a year, 6 months to a year, is that the new things that you have not yet seen on Ethereum start emerging on Bitcoin L2s, because there's reason for projects to not go first build on ETH and then replicate it on Bitcoin, but go first to Bitcoin, because that is such a huge market and not as crowded. And if you win on Bitcoin, the difference is you win the entire market and you can get bigger than any other DeFi project out there today. And you actually have the chance to expand beyond this, I guess, still slight kind of bubble of DeFi on Ethereum and Solana.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're selling me on it right now. So what would stop someone from doing that then? Because the opportunity is there either to be the first or be the best, especially right now.
I think what could stop people is that the UX is not quite where it is. We're moving as fast as possible. We have smart accounts. We have intents, like we build, like Bob's mission is to take this innovation, make it accessible on Bitcoin. So with smart accounts with Bob, we have intents that allow you to one-click deploy Bitcoin into different vaults. But it's still new. So you do need to spend a bit more time with Bitcoin, and it's not as easy to, I guess,
deploy a dApp or something the way it would be with
deploying dApps and Bob is just like on a P stack, but I think the iterative improvements are not as easy, right? Because there's a lot of things that work on Ethereum, but if you want to innovate, you have to understand how Bitcoin works as an asset and what the value of Bitcoin is to then use that in your product. And that takes some time to really, learn about Bitcoin, understand like its adoption, understand what people like doing with it, understand the Bitcoin community. And the Bitcoin community is slightly different than Ethereum. There are, of course, DeFi users on Ethereum, so you can start there. But if you want to grow the pie and not just fight for the same users as ETH2 is already fighting for, you have to take a slightly different approach. It's a slower approach. It requires patience, and it requires an understanding that a lot of Bitcoin is institutionalized or in the hands of individuals. And people are very cautious about what they do with it.
Yes.
And you have to also meet them where they already are. And that is, I think, a bit of a different thing to just deploying an app onto Ethereum where you have the users there. On Bitcoin, you have to do the same thing, but it's not just deploying an app to L2. You have to go and find the users. You have to meet them where they are today. And that's ledger users. That's users of institutional custody. That's users of, in the near future, of staking products, because that's where that's an easy entry point. That's users of WBTC on Ethereum, for example. And it just takes a bit more patience, because Bitcoin is a bit of a difficult beast to master. If you try to come in for a quick money and, build something very quickly, launch, and you expect to get a lot of TVL organically, Bitcoin's going to chew you up, spit you out, right? So you have to have this persistence and patience to stick around and be very tactical about how you approach your go-to-market strategy, because just copy pasting something from Ethereum, sure, you can heavily incentivize liquidity, but if there's nothing special about it as compared to an ETH2, why would somebody use that? And that's something that we've been focusing on as Bob, and also trying to help the dApps that build on Bob, is to really help them get access to the user base that you don't have on Ethereum by plugging this into institutional custody, by plugging this into Bitcoin wallets, and allowing users to one-click deploy Bitcoin into these different products without having to, go to different bridge interfaces and everything, go to different products and spend so much time clicking around when all they want is just a one-click solution.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like on the front of it's hard, and some people just don't want to go on maybe the more difficult path to start. But everything you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. And I also mentioned in the intro, Bob launched Mainnet back in May. How have things progressed since then?
So we launched, as you said, in May, and our main focus initially was to build a backbone DeFi infrastructure and ecosystem. So make sure we have lending protocols, make sure we have DEXs, and on top of that, then start adding perps, start adding aggregators, start adding managed TVL, the liquidity management software and products, plug into like make sure that we support all 350 plus EVM wallets, make sure we support institutional custody, because DeFi, there are certain expectations to DeFi today, and you have to meet those if you really want to grow an ecosystem. And in parallel, we've been working on two things, or like mainly actually it's one thing, but they turned into two. Initially, we worked on let's get like making these deployments easy. So we built something called Bob Gateway, which allowed you to go from Bitcoin into any wrap BTC asset on Bob without having to go to like a TBTC minting page, or, you know, WBTC doesn't even allow retail users to mint, making that accessible. So now you could then one click, just if you want to go to Bitcoin, use your Bitcoin on Bob, it's one click from any Bitcoin wallet into Bob, and you can start using Bitcoin on Bob. And then we'd add smart accounts, and that allow people, like allow apps to even abstract away that there's even like an EVM based chain on there, and you know you can pay gas and whatever. So making that more accessible. And as you see, like that's something that, you know, it's a longer running game, and it does pay off, because what this turned into is Bob Stake, which is now this one-click aggregator that allows you to deploy Bitcoin not only into TBTC and WBTC, but into dozens of different Bitcoin yield products. And I said the bad words, Bitcoin staking products is, I guess, the better way of calling it.
Either are.
So you could deploy it into Babylon LSTs with one click, and you have access to all of, like almost all of them today. You could also deploy into DeFi vaults, and we have already a bunch of DeFi protocols on Bob that have plugged into this interface. And now you can do things as simple as I just want some wrap Bitcoin, and you can go as complex as, okay, I want to have Bitcoin through, for example, solve BTC, stake into Babylon, put into lending, loop it, or like go leveraged or borrow stablecoins against and do something with stablecoin. Yeah. Compressed into one single transaction.
The latter one's losing me though. I feel like that's super complicated. The former one makes sense, but like how accessible do you think this actually is for most people who want to do these things? Like, are there explainers out there?
It depends, of course. I mean, there's of course explainers, and each protocol, can explain the steps that what exactly you're doing underneath. But there's a bunch of teams specializing in this, right? That offer you these vaults on Ethereum already, and what they just get on Bob. And the goal on our side is not to create these super complex strategies. We have the infrastructure so that now anyone can create their vault and offer it up to people, and you don't have to deal with the complexity of getting Bitcoin in. That's all there. And the benefit for you, if you plug into this from the EVM and the DeFi side, or you're like, let's say you have a tokenized position that, where your Bitcoin is doing something and then you've tokenized it. So let's say you stake it with Babylon as an LST. Now you have tokenized it, and now you can use that as collateral to borrow stablecoin. Now, if you plug this in to this Bob Stake interface, you get access to things like staking rewards, which are using Bob Stake for their users, and many other partners that we're going to be announcing over the next couple of days and weeks. Because for the infrastructure players, the wallets, that arguably the distribution channels, institutional custody, wallets, aggregators, for them, the Bitcoin part is the complex one. And if with Bob Stake, they get kind of simple integration, which gives them access to all of these different products. And that just creates this marketplace kind of design where, if you're building on Bob, you get access to all these distribution channels, and vice versa. If you plug Bob Stake in, you get access to all of these different Bitcoin products. And of course, some people, and the majority of people, prefer something very simple. But again, one of the biggest use cases for Bitcoin is borrowing against it. So borrowing a stablecoin against BTC is pretty straightforward. And then you could receive that stablecoin, in your crypto credit card and start spending it, or you go and you buy something with it, right? But instead of just putting plain Bitcoin into there, you could first stake it to, have staking rewards accruing. And, if you're open to that additional, of course, risk, well, then you don't have to go click around and look for different ways to do that. It's just, you just turn on a switch, or you just pick a different strategy. So instead of, okay, I want to borrow against a Bitcoin, I'm going to first stake it and then borrow. And it doesn't add any complexity. So you can really go as sophisticated as you like. It's still only one click. And some strategies may be more complex, and for more advanced users, others are very simple. But the benefit is that we abstract away the complexity of dealing with wrapping the Bitcoin and figuring out how to because there's so many different Bitcoin versions as well. And like, you have to figure out, how do I get into that strategy first? And that's all hidden.
Right. No, okay, that makes more sense. If it's like one plugin and then you get access to everything, opposed to like having to do it over and over and over.
Yeah. And with the next release, you'll be able to pay fees in Bitcoin itself. So you don't really have to deal with any other assets. You put Bitcoin in, and then eventually you take Bitcoin out and you pay everything in Bitcoin. And that just makes it so much more usable and accessible, I believe. And again, that's also the feedback that we've been receiving from all these partners.
I think staking and yield makes sense. And we've had some other guests on who have talked about like staking products for Bitcoin. And I know Bob's ecosystem has projects in that, as well as like bridging, wallets, infrastructure, security, and so on. Out of all the categories that are being built on Bob right now, where do you see, you know, maybe the most untapped potential aside from staking? Because we just talked about that.
So I think it's there's two things. There is, I guess, the boring thing, but that's what the market
boring
wants.
Works,
yeah, but it's what people want. People want to do stuff with their Bitcoin. They want to earn on their Bitcoin. They want to put it to work. Well, if you're able, and the biggest opportunity right now is to take LSTs, but also other assets, like ways to build these Bitcoin vaults and do that and make it accessible, and then work with teams like Bob to, you know, plug it into, I mean, the ultimate win here would be to plug it into Ledger so that you, I mean, you can already use your Ledger to stake and like
so
use
you
it
can
on
like
Bob.
self-custody it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes, exactly. It goes
from your
more or less. So you have Bitcoin in your Ledger, and then you just sign a transaction, and it ends up in your Ledger as well, but as a yield-bearing position. And building these strategies and working with these providers of Bitcoin, so companies that specialize in like having Bitcoin, from custodying it for users, which can act as a distribution channel, figuring that out and like making that more accessible, that is the lowest hanging fruit. Because if you manage to do that, there's so much Bitcoin out there, and people definitely want to use it. Not everyone, but a lot of people want to use it. And, you know, making that process smooth, and maybe also connecting it with like fiat on and off ramps, and plugging this into maybe also like fintech apps, that I think is a massive opportunity. And it is related to staking, but what I'm saying is building this layer on top of, like, building this DeFi infrastructure on top of staking, and not stopping just at on-chain, but also building these connections to the fiat world, because ultimately Bitcoin has a much broader, much bigger community of also non-Web3 expert users that you can actually now address. And that the biggest opportunity here is growing the pie of Web3 users this way.
Yeah, I agree with that. It doesn't have to be just like Web3 native people, but maybe someone who owns Bitcoin that wants to use it, like you said. Would you say that's like the best utility for it today?
I mean, what's the best utility? I guess it's subjective, right?
Well,
everybody
that's what I'm
has
asking
their own risk tolerance. I think, I mean, for me personally, right, I'm of course someone who's cautious about what they do with their Bitcoin. But on the other hand, I do want to do something, and I would pick DeFi over centralized exchanges any day. It's more accessible. It's becoming easier to use. The on-ramps are getting better, and the products are better, frankly speaking, because you can compound them, you can combine them. It's an open ecosystem where innovation happens so much quicker versus you have to, I mean, how do you innovate in a centralized exchange or even in a bank, right? You have to buy, you get you access to the internal APIs, right? So complicated. Why did Coinbase create Base? Well, because now you have an ecosystem which plugs into their exchange where you can build all the products that they never thought of. And I guess that's the same case for Bitcoin, right?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Given that Bob's in its early days, what would you like to accomplish in, let's say, the first year post mainnet and then long term?
Our goal right now, and the first step, was really to level this playing field, right? Ethereum was up here with like so many people chasing it. Bitcoin was down there in terms of the time to market. If you're building an app, usability and things you could build on it. So what we've been focused on is getting to the same level. And that's why we picked the hybrid design. That's why we're OP Stack Chain. That's how you work with all these best in-class infrastructure providers who are all very interested to figure out ways how they can get exposure to the Bitcoin community and onboard these hundreds I guess the number is between 100 and 300 million Bitcoin users today, depending how you count, getting them into their ecosystems. So that's the first step. And the second step really is making these Bitcoin products more accessible. So not just having this infrastructure for builders, but then helping them also with the distribution channels. And also really, because we have spent a lot of time in Bitcoin, we understand how that ecosystem operates. And we also understand the importance of also institutional integrations, because a lot of Bitcoin has been institutionalized, and it's very important to also plug into that, much more important probably than on Ethereum. So that's obviously one thing. And then in parallel, we're working on the technical research with BitVM2. We have, together with Robin, the inventor of BitVM, we have released a design that is really practical and gets us very, very close to creating Bitcoin layer 2s that have similar properties as ETH2s. And that's currently what we're working on, and really getting this into production. So prototypes, making sure we've covered every practical aspect of the design as well, and really pushing it to testnet and mainnet, and making sure that we have not only shown that, yes, there's interest in Bitcoin alternatives, but we have validated and proven that it's not just smokes and mirrors. It actually works, because a lot of people still don't fully understand the design. And because there have been so many Bitcoin layer 2s that are not really technically related to Bitcoin at all, and don't admit it, however, right? So I think it's like Bob is clearly an ETH2 today. We're very transparent about what Bob is today and what we're working on. We're contributing to these core implementations and designs. But because, as with every hype topic, there's a lot of affiliation of projects that have nothing to do with Bitcoin just to, increase their FTV, there is some skepticism right now. It's like, okay, people have a hard time telling what's right and what's wrong. And that's why the goal here is to ship these implementations, these products, and make sure that we could actually allow users to put the Bitcoin into Bob, and with a guarantee that they can always get it out as long as Bitcoin works, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that is in parallel to the product side. That is a technical roadmap that we're working on. And of course, coming again from Bob's hybrid angle, we want to do that while retaining the connection to Ethereum.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, I'm excited to see how that pans out. The last thing I would like to ask, Alexei, before I ask you for advice, which we ask our users, or I guess our guests, I should say, what else are you watching in the crypto ecosystem that we haven't discussed already that you think others listening in should pay attention to?
That's a tough one. Let me think. I mean, I'm obviously so biased. I watch everything that's related to Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested, and I think things to watch. I mean, sure, we have the native Web3 things, like smart accounts and infrastructure there. We have prediction markets, and I think that is actually very interesting. But, people are aware of all of these things, and I'm not going to say AI on blockchain because I'm not even sure if that's going to be a thing. I'm happy to be proven wrong. But what I personally am excited about is looking at emerging markets, and where people actually are using stablecoins on Tron mainly today, and they actually are looking for better solutions, mm-hmm. and how that kind of the products that will emerge there, I think, are some of the most exciting ones, and the ones that will shape how Web3 looks like in a couple of years. Because in the US, in Europe, in China, let's be frank, it's mostly speculation or parking capital and really kind of a financial product. But in Latin America, for example, or in Southeast Asia, people have embraced this at a very different level. You have people that are using stablecoins to just as their main kind of way of sending assets, or for payments even. And the friction between the traditional financial system and the Web3 ecosystems, that's where these things, that is getting fixed in these regions and by teams that are building there on the ground, on site. And that's why we travel so much. And that's why we try to connect with these local communities, because that's where I see Bitcoin's potential to be the strongest. Because Bitcoin, you don't have to sell. The biggest, and that's, I think, again, and I keep repeating the same thing, obviously I'm biased. But I would really also look at Bitcoin itself and see what use cases emerge on the intersection of Bitcoin and the fiat world, in the context of no longer just Lightning but actually with proper infrastructure and tooling and things that are usable. Because one thing that Bitcoin has that no other Web3 project or digital asset has is the brand, right? Apple spent billions of dollars so that when you see the Apple logo, you know exactly what that is. Well, Bitcoin has that already. Mm-hmm. Only 3 to 5% of the world's population have crypto, but I would bet many, many more people know about Bitcoin. 100%. And using Bitcoin as an entry point, because it is now mainstream, it is no longer, hated upon by banks and so on. Like all these reports about Bitcoin being bad for climate and so on, they're gone, right? Because now suddenly banks can sell you ETFs. So it's no longer in their interest to push this narrative. So suddenly Bitcoin is mainstream. Bitcoin is okay. Bitcoin is cool. Bitcoin is trustworthy. Bitcoin is this one thing that everybody knows. Mm-hmm. Well, and now, when you want to offer a new product to someone, if you're doing it on Bitcoin, you don't have to explain to them what proof of stake is. You don't have to explain to them your complex kind of mechanism of, whatever chain you're building on. It's Bitcoin. You can do payments on Bitcoin. You can borrow against your Bitcoin and stablecoins, but it's all on Bitcoin, secure by Bitcoin. And you're not lying, because if you're building on a Bitcoin layer 2, that is what you're doing. And that simplification is something that I think people should be paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. I agree with most of that. I think I would argue most people know what Bitcoin is. We would be unfortunately surprised how few people know what Ethereum is. And then, it just goes down with more and more of the blockchains outside of this ecosystem. But I do agree with you on that point that it is like a brand. Last major thing, Alexei, can you leave us with a piece of advice? You've been in this industry for a long time, so share some wisdom.
I mean, I've been doing this for a while, and I've been just doing so many mistakes. Like we started with building tech because we thought tech was really cool. And we built tech because we wanted to have the best technology and the most decentralized way of using Bitcoin. But we kind of ignored the facts that, we have to talk to users first. And that's from our previous experience before building Bob. Right. We went through this process of, and we got, infected by this kind of mentality that is present across a lot of like ecosystems in the space of, I'm going to build the best tech and people will come. Don't do that. Talk to users. Try to understand what people actually want. Sometimes it's boring, but there can be a lot of innovation in things that are simple. You don't have to overcomplicate. And in general, when I look at something and we talk with a lot of investors and like anything Bitcoin related, people do approaches and like ask us to look at it. Anything that is convoluted, very complex, generally doesn't work. The simpler, the better. And BitVM seems complex if you look at it, but what actually it does behind the scenes is very, very straightforward. That's why I think it's going to work. But again, here on the example of BitVM as well, if we focus on only the technical aspect without thinking about how will users actually access this thing, it's never going to work. And that's also like our job in this design space, is to really focus on the pragmatism and trying to make it usable. So I guess my advice is only because a lot of people use buzzwords and very fancy terminology, I would argue that most people don't fully understand how these things work. And the simpler you can build something, the more accessible to users, the better. Mm-hmm. Just only building for tech doesn't always win.
I agree 100%. Thank you so much for coming on today. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.